The wind howled across the high plains of the Mercer Ranch, a lonely, keening sound that scraped at the soul. It was a blade of a wind, slicing through the tall, sun-bleached grass and rattling the bones of the old homestead. Dusk was bleeding across the sky, a deep, bruised purple that outlined the distant hills in jagged silhouette. Corbin Hayes wiped the grime from his hands onto the worn fabric of his coat, his movement slow and deliberate, a habit born from years of solitude. The evening chores were done. The horses were settled in the barn, their soft nickering a comforting counterpoint to the wind's mournful song, and the fences stood strong against the vast, empty expanse. Everything was as it should be, a predictable rhythm in a life deliberately stripped of surprises. And then he heard it. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the shriek of a hawk. It was a human sound, a thin, desperate whimper almost entirely devoured by the wind. "Please? I can't breathe." The voice was a woman's, choked with panic and exhaustion. Corbin froze, every muscle in his body going rigid. His heart, usually a slow and steady drum, began to pound against his ribs like a trapped bird. He scanned the horizon, his eye sweeping over the desolate landscape. Not a soul lived out here. Not for 20 miles in any direction. His nearest neighbor was a hard day's ride away, and they hadn't spoken in a year. Yet the voice had been undeniable, a fragile plea cutting through the immense, crushing emptiness of the plains. His hand drifted instinctively toward the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, the worn leather a familiar comfort. He moved toward the dilapidated old shed at the edge of his property, his boots crunching on the dry, cracked earth. Each step felt unnaturally loud, an announcement of his presence in the heavy silence that had fallen between gusts of wind. There was no sign of a horse, no flicker of a campfire, no threat he could see or measure. There was only that sound of raw, unadulterated fear. The shed door hung crookedly on a single rusted hinge, groaning as the wind pushed against it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust, dried leather, and forgotten time. The last rays of sunlight speared through the gaps in the warped wooden walls, illuminating a swirling galaxy of dust motes. Shapes and shadows lurked in the corners, tools of a life he'd left behind, ghosts of old projects and failed dreams. Then, his eyes adjusted, and he saw her. Huddled in the far corner, almost completely covered by a large, filthy burlap sack, was a small figure. She was curled into a tight ball, like a terrified field mouse hiding from a hawk. A tremor ran through her body, a violent, uncontrollable shiver that had nothing to do with the evening chill. A knot of ice formed in Corbin's stomach. He moved closer, his boots stirring up puffs of dirt from the floor. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and reached out a tentative hand to lift the edge of the coarse burlap. The material was thick and suffocating, reeking of old grain and mildew. The way she trembled beneath it, a desperate, silent plea for air, made his chest tighten with a forgotten ache. Hey now," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough and gravelly from disuse. "It's all right. You're safe. I'm here." There was no response, only the sound of her breathing, a series of shallow, ragged gasps that sounded painful and labored. Corbin took hold of the heavy sack, his calloused fingers snagging on something hard and angular beneath its folds. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through him. Every instinct, honed by a life of loss and survival on the frontier, screamed at him to be cautious. His mind, a place he tried to keep quiet, flooded with the worst possibilities. Was she injured? Was this a trap? Was she a decoy for something far more sinister waiting in the growing darkness? The wind whistled a high, lonely note through the cracks in the shed, and for a terrifying moment, he thought her ragged breathing had stopped altogether. Just then, a flicker of movement at the open doorway caught his eye. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the twilight, a tall, broad shape standing just outside, watching. Corbin's blood ran cold. He froze, the sack still half lifted, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm in his ears. That was no stray animal. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was intelligent, deliberate, and it wasn't him. The night, which had felt merely lonely, now felt malevolent. The very air grew heavy, thick with unspoken danger. Corbin's hand trembled, not with fear for himself, but with a sudden, fierce surge of protectiveness. He met the silent gaze of the shadow with his own wide, weary eyes. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. Then, with a surge of desperate resolve, he yanked the sack free. Beneath it, she lay crumpled and impossibly small. She was a young woman, Chinese, her features delicate even under the layers of dirt and grime. Her face was a canvas of bruises, a dark purple blooming on her cheekbone and a cut across her brow that was still sluggishly weeping blood. Her black hair was matted with sweat and dirt, clinging to her skin in tangled clumps. Her simple cotton tunic was torn and stained. She was gasping, each breath a desperate, wrenching battle for life. And then her eyes, wide, dark, and filled with a universe of terror and pleading, locked onto his. "Please," she rasped, the word barely a puff of air. All caution, all suspicion, evaporated from Corbin's mind. He saw not a stranger, not a threat, but a child in agony. He didn't hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, his movement surprisingly gentle for such a large, rough-hewn man. He was struck by how light she was, a fragile collection of bird bones and desperation. Every muscle in her body seemed to be screaming with exhaustion and pain. He turned and ran, kicking the shed door wide as he burst out into the whipping wind. The shadow at the doorway had vanished. He didn't stop to look for it. He ran toward the solid, reassuring shape of his cabin, the one place in the world that felt safe. The heavy oak door banged shut behind him, the sound echoing through the small space like a gunshot, a final, defiant warning to the encroaching night. He slid the heavy iron bolt into place, the metallic thud a sound of temporary sanctuary. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee, the familiar, grounding scent of his solitary existence. He carried her to the rough-hewn cot in the corner, the only piece of soft furniture he owned, and gently laid her down. He knelt beside her, his large hands, usually occupied with the rough work of the ranch, now moving with an unpracticed tenderness. His heart still pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but his hands were steady. He tore clean strips from an old linen shirt he found in a dusty trunk, one of his late wife's. The memory brought a familiar pang, a ghost of a pain he'd learned to live with. He poured a little whiskey from his flask onto a cloth, the sharp sting of the alcohol a harsh but necessary cleanser. He gently dabbed at her cuts, his touch as light as he could manage. He had little in the way of medical supplies, but he did what he could with clean water, the whiskey, and the linen bandages. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her frantic breathing began to ease, the ragged gasps softening into something closer to a steady rhythm. But her eyes never left his face. They followed his every movement, wide and watchful. In their dark depths, he saw a story of horror and flight that he couldn't yet begin to comprehend. His work done for the moment, his gaze drifted to the window. Outside, in the fading light, he saw things he hadn't noticed in his frantic rush. There were strange markings in the dirt near the shed, not from his boots or from any animal he knew. Deep, angry gouges were half hidden in the shadows, as if something heavy had been dragged. And snagged on a thorny bush near the fence line was a scrap of torn black silk, a fabric far too fine for this rough country. Embroidered on it in red thread was a symbol he'd never seen before, a coiled serpent biting its own tail. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, tightened its grip on his gut. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't some drifter lost on the plains. This was organized. Whoever was after this girl had left a calling card. They were sending a message. Corbin sank back on his heels, rubbing a hand over his weary, stubbled face. Memories, ugly and unwelcome, began to claw their way up from the depths where he kept them buried. Faces of those he'd lost, of the family he couldn't protect. Mistakes he'd made that echoed through the long, silent years. The sudden, immense weight of protecting someone new, someone so fragile, pressed down on him harder than any physical burden ever could. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, and this time, it seemed to carry other sounds with it. Voices, distorted and faint, carried on the gale. The distant, rhythmic thud of hoofbeats, growing steadily, ominously, closer. It was the kind of sound that twisted your stomach into a cold knot and froze the blood in your veins. He could ride for help. The nearest town, Redemption Gulch, lay 30 miles to the east, a hard journey over unforgiving terrain. But he knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his soul, that no one would arrive in time. The roads were long and empty, and the night was a predator. Help was a distant, useless hope. They were on their own. Corbin's jaw clenched, his expression hardening into a grim mask of resolve. He looked at the young woman on the cot, her chest rising and falling with each precious breath. His hands hovered over her, not in uncertainty, but in a silent, unwavering promise of protection. Then, a voice, sharp and clear, pierced the night, slicing through the howl of the wind. A man's voice, cold and insistent, calling out a name from the darkness. "My Ling!" Corbin's pulse thudded in his ears. They knew her name. They weren't searching blindly. They were hunting. And in that single, terrifying moment, the thin veil of safety the cabin had offered shattered into a million pieces. Night had fallen completely, a heavy, suffocating blanket of blackness that pressed down on the small cabin. The sky was starless, the moon hidden behind a thick shroud of clouds. Corbin moved with a quiet, practiced urgency, his actions economical and precise. He dragged a heavy wooden chest in front of the door and began boarding up the two small windows, hammering the nails into the frames with controlled, muffled blows. Each thud of the hammer felt like a frantic heartbeat punctuating the tense silence inside. He knew with a chilling certainty that the sounds outside were no longer just the wind. Someone, or something, was out there, circling, watching, waiting. The young woman, My Ling, lay on the cot, her skin unnaturally pale in the flickering lamplight. A violent tremor still racked her small frame, a physical manifestation of the terror that held her in its grip. Her shallow breaths were a constant, fragile reminder of how close to the edge she was. Corbin moved to her side, pulling a thick wool blanket over her. He placed a hand on hers, a gesture of reassurance. Her hand was as cold as ice. "Talk to me," he said, his voice low and steady, a rock in the swirling sea of her fear. "You need to tell me what happened." "Who are they?" Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper, thin and reedy. I saw them." Her eyes darted toward the boarded-up window, as if she could see the monsters lurking in the dark. They killed my father. In the city. He made a deal with them, for the railroad." Her words came in broken, halting fragments. "Important men. Powerful men. They can't let anyone know what they did. They can't let me live." Corbin's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. Powerful men. Railroad barons. The kind of men who built empires on the bones of others, whose secrets could burn lives to the ground. He leaned closer, his eyes scanning the impenetrable shadows beyond the cabin walls. A branch snapped just outside. The sound was as loud as a pistol shot in the charged atmosphere. His pulse spiked, and his hand tightened on the stock of the rifle he'd propped against his chair. "Why here? Why run to me?" he asked, his voice gentle but insistent. I didn't know where else to go," she admitted, her voice cracking with a sob she fought to suppress. "I ran. For days. I saw the smoke from your chimney. I saw you. You worked alone. You were not like them." Corbin studied her face, searching her terrified eyes for the truth. Her story was full of gaping holes, missing pieces like a shattered vase. Every fragment she offered only raised more questions. But there was one thing he didn't doubt for a second: the raw, primal fear radiating from her was real. And fear this potent was a magnet for danger. Outside, the night was alive with menacing whispers. The rustling in the bushes wasn't just the wind. The sound of horses hooves striking the distant dirt road grew louder, a relentless, approaching drumbeat of doom. Corbin moved silently to the door, pressing his ear against the solid wood, listening. He began setting crude but effective traps around the cabin's perimeter, tripwires made of twine connected to stacks of rattling tins, a deep pit hidden beneath a thin layer of brush near the barn. He retrieved his rifle from the wall, checking the action and laying out a box of cartridges on the small table. He slipped two well-honed knives into his boots. Every tool of survival, every dirty trick he'd learned over a lifetime of living on the edge of a lawless land, came flooding back to him. Mai Ling shivered again, a violent, convulsive shudder. Corbin returned to her side and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, murmuring words of reassurance he wasn't sure he believed himself. As he looked at her, so young and so terrified, the ghosts of his own past rose to haunt him. The faces of his wife, Maria, and his young son, Daniel, lost to a raid by marauders 10 years ago. He hadn't been fast enough then. He hadn't been strong enough. The choices he'd failed to make had weighed on him every day since, a heavier burden than any saddle or pack. That old, familiar guilt sharpened his resolve into a razor's edge. He would not fail again. He would protect this girl, no matter the cost. She coughed, a weak, rattling sound from deep in her chest. "They'll come," she whispered, her voice filled with a dreadful certainty. "I know," he said simply, his voice a low, hard growl. "But you're not facing them alone." And then, time seemed to freeze. A shadow blotted out the thin crack of light at the edge of one of the boarded-up windows. It was too large to be a coyote, too still and deliberate to be a trick of the wind. Mai Ling's eyes widened in horrified recognition. A sharp, terrified gasp escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Corbin's hand snapped to his rifle, yanking it up to his shoulder. His heart hammered against his ribs, every one of his senses screaming an alarm. Outside, the darkness seemed to lean in closer, a sentient entity tasting the fear that saturated the air inside the small cabin. In that frozen instant, the fragile sanctuary he had built felt as thin and brittle as a sheet of ice. The night shattered. The front door exploded inwards, splintering under the force of a massive, brutal kick. Wood cracked and flew across the room like shrapnel, a violent spray of warning. Corbin's heart slammed into his throat. Adrenaline, hot and sharp, surged through his veins. "Get down," he roared, shoving the table aside. Mai Ling reacted instantly, tumbling from the cot and scrambling under it, her scream a raw, sharp blade of sound in the sudden chaos. The intruder who filled the doorway was a silhouette of brutal purpose, as dark and menacing as the night he'd come from. Corbin met him just inside the doorway, his fists clenched, his body a wall of pure, unthinking fury. The cabin, once his haven, shrank around them, becoming a claustrophobic arena for a desperate, violent struggle. Every swing of a fist, every grunting impact of body against body, echoed off the wooden walls, reverberating like the thunder of an approaching storm. A gun went off, the deafening blast and the flash of orange light blinding in the small space. Smoke, acrid and stinging, filled the air. Corbin ducked, the bullet whistling past his ear, and swung the heavy stock of his rifle like a club. He connected with a sickening crunch of bone. Pain shot up his arm from the impact. The intruder staggered back, grunting in pain, but he was far from finished. He lunged forward, a long, gleaming knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. It was chaos. A whirlwind of fear, pain, and the primal instinct for survival. From under the cot, Mai Ling crawled toward the corner, dragging a heavy wooden chair with her, holding it up like a flimsy shield. "Corbin," she screamed, her voice shrill with terror. He couldn't spare her a glance. Not yet. Not while the threat was a living, breathing monster of violence, pressing in on him, as real and as heavy as the floorboards beneath his feet. And then, in the flickering lamplight, he saw it. Etched into the man's leather vest, and tattooed on the thick cords of his neck, was the same symbol from the scrap of silk, the coiled serpent. The Syndicate. He'd heard whispers of them, stories told in hushed tones in the saloons of Redemption Gulch. A powerful organization run by ruthless men who controlled everything from the railroads to the mines with an iron fist. Men who killed without a second thought. Men who were now irrevocably tied to this girl and the terror that had descended upon his ranch. Corbin's mind flashed back again, the image of his wife and son's faces so clear it stole his breath. The anger and grief he'd carried for a decade erupted, fueling his arms with a strength he didn't know he possessed. He roared, a sound of pure rage, and struck again, and again, each blow carrying the crushing weight of old sorrow and new fury. But the intruder was a professional, cunning and quick. He slipped on a patch of spilled water, twisted away from a killing blow, and with a surprising agility, vanished through a loose panel in the back wall of the cabin, a root cellar access Corbin hadn't used in years. Just as quickly as it began, it was over. The cabin fell silent, the only sounds the crackling of the lamp and Corbin's own ragged, heaving breaths. The thick, black smoke hung in the air, burning his lungs. Mai Ling was still huddled on the floor, shivering, clutching herself as if trying to hold her own fragile body together. Corbin's chest heaved, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest. He stumbled toward the wall where the intruder had disappeared. Scratched deep into the wood next to the opening was the serpent symbol, a fresh, gleaming wound in the old timber. It was a threat. A promise. His stomach clenched. Mai Ling's wide, terrified eyes followed his gaze. What? What does it mean? She whispered, her voice trembling. Corbin shook his head, a toxic cocktail of anger and dread pooling in his chest. He looked at the shattered door, the chaos of their sanctuary, and then back at her. It means this is far from over. From outside, carried on the cold night wind, came the sound of the intruder's laugh, a low, mocking sound that promised more violence to come. The night seemed darker now, heavier. The danger had not been repelled, it had merely slipped past the thin barrier of their walls and was now inside their lives. The ranch that had been his refuge for 10 years now felt like a fragile, indefensible cage. Corbin clenched his fists, the knuckles raw and bleeding. He glanced at Mai Ling, who was slowly, shakily, getting to her feet. She met his gaze and nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. They would have to leave. Safety was an illusion. Their only hope for justice, and for survival, now lay somewhere beyond these familiar hills, out in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of lawlessness and vengeance. And in that quiet, heavy pause, both of them knew, with a terrible certainty, that the chase had only just begun. Dawn broke slowly, painting the valley in bruised shades of orange and grey. Corbin and Mai Ling moved like ghosts in the pre-dawn gloom, their actions silent but deliberate. Every step was measured, every rustle of brush a potential alarm. Every whisper of the wind could be the sound of the syndicate closing in. They had no choice. The cabin, his home, was a tomb waiting to be sealed. It was no longer safe. Corbin hoisted Mai Ling onto the back of his steadiest horse, Old Ben, his hands gently steadying her trembling form. "Hold tight," he murmured, his voice low and reassuring. She nodded, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a fragile, blossoming trust. It was a trust that had been forged in the crucible of blood, sweat, and a long night spent hiding from the encroaching darkness. The open terrain stretched before them, a daunting panorama of rolling hills, jagged rock formations, and dry grass that whipped at their faces like tiny lashes. The wind was a constant companion, carrying distant, menacing sounds, the faint echo of hoofbeats, the sharp crack of a rifle far off in the distance. Their pursuers were relentless, trained hunters who killed without hesitation or remorse. But Corbin had grit. He had a lifetime of experience etched into the lines on his face. Survival was stitched into the very fabric of his bones. He led the horse not along the open trails, but through hidden paths, weaving under the cover of scattered boulders and through deep, shadowed ravines. "We stick to the shadows," he whispered, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Keep low. Keep quiet." Mai Ling clutched the horse's manet, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every breath she took was a conscious effort, a mixture of raw terror and a burgeoning determination to live. The sand and dust kicked up by the horse's hooves were blinding at times. A twig snapped nearby. Instinctively, Corbin pulled the horse to a halt, ducking behind a rocky ridge. Mai Ling slid from the horse's back and followed, her movement surprisingly agile. They crouched together, hearts pounding in unison, listening to the silence. The sound of distant, angry shouts drifted on the wind, then faded. They had managed to stay one step ahead. For now. Hours crawled by, each moment a tense battle of wits, courage, and endurance. And yet, in the small spaces between the waves of fear, a fragile bond began to form. She shared fragments of her story, telling him of her father, a proud merchant from San Francisco who believed in the promise of this new land. She spoke of the deal he'd made with a powerful man named Alastair Blackwood, a man who built railroads and destroyed lives with equal dispassion. The deal had gone sour, and her father had been silenced. She, the sole witness, had been marked for death. Corbin, in turn, found himself opening up in a way he hadn't in a decade. He spoke of Maria and Daniel, of the life he'd had before the silence descended. He told her how the marauders had come at dusk, just like this, and how he'd been away, checking a distant fence line. By the time he returned, all that was left were ashes and ghosts. In sharing their tragedies, they found a small piece of shared humanity, a quiet understanding that transcended words. Finally, as the sun began its descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the land, the dusty rooftops of Redemption Gulch appeared on the horizon, rising like a set of broken teeth against the sky. A flicker of hope, the first he'd allowed himself to feel, ignited in Corbin's chest. He'd sent a rider ahead 2 days prior, a young trapper who owed him a favor, with a message for Sheriff Reed, one of the few lawmen in the territory that Corbin trusted. It was a long shot, but it was the only one he had. As they drew closer, the sounds of chaos reached them. Horses galloped through the town's single dusty street. The law had arrived. Sheriffs, deputies, and a posse of brave townsfolk were finally moving to meet the encroaching chaos. Gunshots rang out, sharp and clear, but this time, the balance had shifted. The syndicate men, caught between Corbin's approach from the east and the law from the west, were caught in a pincer. They fell back, surprised and confronted by uniformed, organized resistance. Corbin guided the horse through the final, treacherous stretch of land, Meiling's legs trembling with exhaustion, her breaths coming in ragged but steady waves. She was alive. They paused at the top of a low hill, the town sprawled below them, a chaotic but welcome sight. Safety, or at least the promise of it, was within reach. Meiling exhaled a long, shuddering breath, and tears of relief finally broke free, streaking clean paths through the layers of dust and grime on her cheeks. "We made it," she whispered, the words filled with awe and disbelief. Corbin's gaze swept the horizon, his expression still haunted, but his eyes steady. He knew this was not the end. The road ahead was not free of scars. Alastair Blackwood was not a man to give up easily. The memories of the chase, the violence, the loss, would linger like stubborn shadows in the corners of their minds. But in this moment, as they looked down upon the town, survival, resilience, and a small, stubborn sliver of hope burned brighter than any darkness that lay behind them. The wind, for the first time, seemed to carry not threats, but the last whispers of danger, blowing them away into the vast, empty plains. They had faced the long night, they had battled the ruthless, and they had survived, together. And though their journey was far from over, for now, in the golden light of a new day, they could finally breathe.